Lake Superior, Minnesota, 2013. The Blackwood family vacation had been perfect until that day. James and Sarah, both doctors at Mayo Clinic, had rented a lakeside cabin for 2 weeks with their 11-year-old twin daughters, Emma and Lily. The identical twins were inseparable, with matching auburn hair and the same constellation of freckles across their noses, distinguishable only by the small birthmark on Emma's left wrist and their different colored sneakers. Purple for Emma, teal for Lily. It was day 8 of their vacation when they decided to hike the Cliffside Trail, a moderately difficult path that ran along the rugged shoreline of Lake Superior before looping back through dense forest. The August morning was clear, the temperature mild. Ideal hiking conditions. "Stay where we can see you," Sarah reminded the girls as they bounded ahead on the trail, their matching backpacks bouncing against their shoulders. Inside each pack was a water bottle, trail mix, a whistle, and a small first aid kit. Sarah's medical training made her meticulous about safety. "We know, Mom," the twins replied in unison, sharing the secret smile they reserved for each other when their parents were being overprotective. The first mile of the hike was uneventful. The family stopped at a scenic overlook, taking photos of the vast expanse of Lake Superior stretching toward the horizon. James checked his watch. 11:15 a.m. They were making good time. "Let's push to the halfway point before we stop for lunch," he suggested. The trail narrowed as they continued, forcing them to walk single file. James took the lead, followed by the twins, with Sarah bringing up the rear. The path curved and twisted, occasionally obscuring the girls from their parents' view for a few seconds at a time. At 11:47 a.m., the family reached a fork in the trail. The right path followed the lake, while the left path began to loop back through the forest. "Let's take the lake route," Sarah said. "The views are supposed to be spectacular." James nodded in agreement, turning to the twins, but the space behind him was empty. "Girls," he called, thinking they had fallen slightly behind. No answer. Sarah looked back along the trail. "They were right behind me just a minute ago." A flicker of concern crossed between them, but neither parent was truly worried yet. The twins were probably just around the last bend, distracted by a chipmunk or interesting plant. James backtracked 20 yards. Nothing. 50 yards. Nothing. 100 yards. Still nothing. "Emma, Lily," he shouted, his voice echoing off the cliff face. Sarah joined him, her doctor's composure beginning to crack. "They can't have gone far. They were literally just here." The minutes stretched into a half hour as James and Sarah frantically searched the trail, calling their daughters' names until their voices grew hoarse. They separated briefly to check both paths at the fork, agreeing to meet back in 15 minutes. Neither found any sign of the twins. At 12:42 p.m., Sarah used her cell phone to call emergency services, her hands shaking so badly she misdialed twice. By sunset, the search had expanded to include park rangers, local police, trained search dogs, and dozens of volunteers. Flashlights swept through the growing darkness as night fell over Lake Superior, the beams reflecting off the water's surface like desperate, questing fingers. The twins' descriptions and photos were distributed. Roadblocks were established at park exits. The lake shore was combed for any sign of a fall, but Emma and Lily Blackwood had vanished as completely as if they had never existed at all. If cases like this keep you thinking long after the video ends, take a moment to help us keep these stories alive. Hit the like button and subscribe to Gone Cold. Every week, we bring you real unsolved mysteries that deserve attention, and your support makes all the difference. The first 72 hours after the disappearance were a blur of activity and mounting dread. The search expanded to cover every inch of the state park and surrounding areas. Divers explored the lake waters near the cliffs, while helicopters with thermal imaging swept the forest. The Blackwood vacation cabin became the unofficial command center, its kitchen table covered with maps marked with search grids and timelines. James and Sarah barely slept, running on adrenaline and the increasingly desperate hope that the next search party would bring good news. By day 4, the case had attracted national attention. The twins' faces, smiling in their most recent school photos, appeared on news broadcasts across the country. The story had all the elements that captivated public interest. Identical twins, successful parents, a beautiful but treacherous natural setting, and the chilling mystery of how two children could vanish without a trace in broad daylight. Detective Marcus Rivera, a 20-year veteran of missing persons cases, arrived from Minneapolis to take lead on the investigation. His first act was to interview the Blackwoods again, probing deeper than the initial questioning. "Did the girls have any reason to run away?" he asked, sitting across from James and Sarah in their rental cabin. "Absolutely not," Sarah replied, her voice hoarse from crying. "They were happy, well-adjusted. We were having a wonderful vacation." "Any issues at school?" "Bullying, problems with friends." James shook his head. "They were popular, good students. Everyone loved the twins." Rivera nodded, making notes. "And the trail itself? You didn't notice anything unusual? Other hikers, wildlife, anything out of place?" The parents exchanged glances. There was a group that passed us going the opposite direction. James recalled. An older couple and what looked like their adult son. But that was at least 20 minutes before the girls disappeared. This group was quickly identified and interviewed, but they had noticed nothing unusual, just a happy family enjoying a hike, the twin girls skipping ahead of their parents. As the investigation continued, 3 main theories emerged. First, that the twins had wandered off the trail and become lost in the wilderness, but the extensive search and the lack of any evidence, not even a discarded water bottle or hair ribbon, made this increasingly unlikely. Second, that they had fallen from the cliffs into the lake. The water was deep enough in places to have potentially carried bodies far from shore, but search divers found no evidence supporting this theory. The third possibility, abduction, was the most disturbing and, as days passed without a trace of the girls, increasingly considered the most likely. If someone took them, Rivera explained to Blackwoods a week into the search, they had to have been familiar with the area. That section of trail has multiple access points where someone could have cut through from the forest side, grabbed the girls during that brief moment they were out of your sight, and disappeared back into the woods. "But there would have been sounds," Sarah insisted, her clinical mind struggling against the horror of the scenario. "Screams, struggles. We would have heard something." Rivera's expression was gentle but grave. "Not necessarily, if they knew what they were doing." The investigation expanded to include registered sex offenders in a 3-state radius, interviews with every park visitor logged that day, and deep background checks on park employees. Nothing concrete emerged. 2 weeks after the disappearance, the active search was scaled back. The Blackwoods, destroyed but unable to abandon the last place their daughters were seen, rented a small house near the park entrance. James took an extended leave of absence from the clinic. Sarah returned to work part-time, finding that the only way to keep functioning was to lose herself in helping others. As months passed, the case grew colder. The twins' bedroom in the Blackwoods' Rochester home remained untouched, a shrine to the children they refused to believe were gone forever. Each year on the anniversary of the disappearance, they returned to hike the cliffside trail, retracing their steps in a ritual of remembrance and desperate hope. But Lake Superior, vast and ancient, kept its secrets. Chapter 3, A Decade of Absence, Rochester, Minnesota, 2023. Sarah Blackwood adjusted her reading glasses, squinting at the patient chart on her computer screen. At 53, she had risen to become chief of pediatric medicine at Mayo Clinic, her once auburn hair now streaked with gray. Her colleagues admired her precision, her dedication, her tireless advocacy for children's health. What they didn't see were the nights she still woke gasping from dreams where she heard her daughters calling from some unreachable distance. They didn't know that she kept the twins' birth certificates and baby shoes in her bedside drawer, touching them each night before she attempted to sleep. The 10th anniversary of the disappearance had passed 3 months ago. She and James had made their annual pilgrimage to the trail, though they had been divorced for 4 years now. The strain of their shared grief eventually fracturing what had once been an unbreakable bond. James had moved to Arizona, starting fresh with a new position and, recently, a new relationship. Sarah had stayed, unable to leave the place where her children might someday find their way back to her. Her office phone rang, jolting her from her thoughts. Dr. Blackwood speaking. "Sarah, it's Marcus." Detective Rivera had remained in contact over the years, updating them whenever the case was reviewed or new lead, however unlikely, was pursued. He had long since been promoted to captain, but he had never fully set aside the case of the Blackwood twins. Something in his voice made Sarah grip the phone tighter. "What is it?" "There's been a development. A significant one. I think you should come to the station." "Tell me now," she demanded, her heart racing. "Please, Marcus." A pause, and a shoe washed up on the Lake Superior shore near Grand Marais yesterday. Children's size. Purple. There are initials written inside the tongue, E.B. Sarah's vision tunneled. The familiar walls of her office fading at the edges. Emma Blackwood. Purple sneakers. The exact shoes her daughter had been wearing the day she disappeared. "I'm on my way," she managed, already grabbing her purse and keys. The 90-minute drive to the police station in Duluth passed in a blur. Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. A shoe surviving 10 years in the lake seemed impossible. Yet here was tangible evidence, the first in a decade, that her daughters had not simply vanished into thin air. Detective Rivera met her in the lobby, his face showing the years that had passed since they first met. He led her to a conference room where the shoe sat on the table, sealed in a clear evidence bag. Despite its years in the water, the shoe was remarkably preserved. The once bright purple had faded to a soft lavender, but the shape was intact. And there, clearly visible through the plastic, was a marking Sarah herself had placed inside both girls' shoes before their vacation. E.B. in permanent marker. "The lake preserves things," Rivera explained. "The cold water, certain conditions, it's not unheard of for object to surface years later, relatively intact." Sarah stared at the shoe, her doctor's mind automatically cataloging details, even as her mother's heart twisted with renewed grief. "Where exactly was it found?" "That's part why I called you in. It was discovered nearly 30 miles northeast of where the girls disappeared, and it was tangled in what appears to be relatively recent debris, not something that's been in the water for 10 years. Sarah looked up sharply. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the shoe likely was in the lake this whole time." Rivera's expression was carefully controlled. Someone could have had it. Someone could have kept it as a memento and only recently disposed of it in the lake. The implication hung in the air between them. If the shoe had been kept by someone for nearly a decade before being discarded, then perhaps the original theory of abduction had been correct. And if that were true, could they still be alive? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, giving voice to the hope she had never fully relinquished. "We can't rule it out," Rivera replied cautiously. "We're reopening the active investigation based on this new evidence. I've already called James, and he's flying in tomorrow. We'll need to revisit everything, all the original suspects, the timeline, everything." Sarah reached toward the evidence bag, her fingers hovering just above the plastic. Inside this small, weathered shoe lay both the crushing weight of a decade's grief and the first fragile possibility that the story of her daughters might not have ended on that trail 10 years ago. "Find them," she said, her voice finding new strength. "Whatever it takes, wherever they are, find my girls." What neither Sarah nor Detective Rivera could know was that 140 miles away, in a small town on the Wisconsin side of the lake, a young woman was frantically packing a bag, her hands shaking as she stuffed clothes into a duffel. On her bedside table lay a newspaper, folded open to a small article about a child's shoe discovered on the shore of Lake Superior. And on her left wrist, partially covered by a leather bracelet, was a small birthmark that had been hidden from view for 10 long years. Twins vanished during family hike. 10 years later, a shoe with initials washes up on Shore Chapter 4. The woman in Wisconsin Superior, Wisconsin. Ellie Bennett's hands wouldn't stop shaking as she threw clothes into her duffel bag. 21 years old, with auburn hair cut short at her shoulders and eyes that had seen too much, she moved with the desperate efficiency of someone who had rehearsed an escape many times in her mind. The newspaper article lay on her bed, innocuous yet devastating in its brevity. Child shoe found on Lake Superior shore, maybe connected to decade-old missing persons case. Only 6 sentences long, buried on page 4. Most readers would have skimmed past it. But for Ellie, those words had shattered the carefully constructed reality she'd been living in since she was 11 years old. "Stupid, so stupid," she muttered, grabbing her wallet and the emergency cash she kept taped beneath her dresser drawer. Nearly $2,000 saved from waitressing tips, hidden dollar by dollar over years. He said he got rid of everything. The small apartment she'd been renting for the past 8 months was sparse, containing little of sentimental value. No photos adorned the walls. No mementos cluttered the shelves. Ellie, if that was truly her name, lived like someone prepared to disappear at a moment's notice. A key turned in the front door lock. Ellie froze, her hand instinctively reaching for the kitchen knife she'd placed on the bed beside her bag. "Ellie? You home, sweetheart?" The voice was gentle, familiar. Carl Bennett, her father, returning from his shift at the paper mill. She relaxed slightly, but kept her hand near the knife. In the bedroom, Dad, just getting ready for work. Footsteps approached her room. Carl appeared in the doorway, still wearing his work clothes, his beard streaked with gray. At 57, he looked older than his years, the lines of his face carved by secrets as much as age. His eyes fell on the duffel bag, then the newspaper, and finally the knife. A profound sadness settled over his features. "You saw the article," he said. "Not a question." "You lied to me," Ellie replied, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "You said you threw everything away. You said we'd be safe." Carl stepped into the room, his movement slow, careful, as if approaching a wounded animal. "I did throw it away. Into the lake. I never thought that it would wash up, that someone would find it." Anger flashed in her eyes. "It has my initials in it, Carl. My real initials." A heavy silence settled between them, thick with a decade of deception. "Where is she?" Ellie finally asked. "Where's my sister?" Carl's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know. I swear to God, Emma, I never knew." Chapter 5. The return of James Blackwood Detective Rivera had secured a conference room at the Duluth Police Department to serve as their command center. Maps of Lake Superior and the surrounding region covered one wall, while photos and timelines from the original investigation filled another. The shoe, still in its evidence bag, sat in the center of the table like a talisman. Sarah Blackwood had barely left the room since she arrived, reviewing old case files as if she might discover something overlooked in the hundreds of previous readings. She looked up when the door opened, her breath catching at the sight of her ex-husband. James Blackwood had aged well, his dark hair now silver at the temples, his tall frame still fit. Arizona had given his skin a permanent tan that made his blue eyes, the same eyes the twins had inherited, even more striking. But those eyes now carried the same desperate hope that Sarah felt coursing through her veins. "James," she said, rising from her chair. They embraced awkwardly, their bodies remembering an intimacy their minds had tried to forget. "I got here as soon as I could," he said, releasing her and turning to Rivera. "You're sure it's Emma's shoe?" Rivera nodded. "The size, color, and initials all match. We've sent it for DNA testing, but given the time it spent in the water, we're not optimistic about retrieving usable samples." James approached the table, staring down at the small purple shoe. "And you think someone kept it all this time? That it wasn't in the lake for 10 years? "The condition suggests it wasn't submerged that long," Rivera confirmed. "And its location, nearly 30 miles from the disappearance site, is interesting. That area of the shoreline is close to a small tourist town called Silver Bay. We're looking into anyone with connections to both that area and the original case." Sarah returned to her seat, watching as James circled the table, physician's mind clearly analyzing every aspect of the evidence before him. "What about the other shoe?" he asked suddenly. "Or Lily's shoes, if they fell into the lake together?" "Nothing else has surfaced," Rivera replied, "which supports our theory that this wasn't an accidental drowning. Someone had this shoe in their possession for years." The implications hung heavy in the air. If the twins had been abducted, if at least one of them had been alive long enough for her shoe to be preserved as some kind of trophy, then what had happened to them in the intervening years? And was there any chance, however small, that after a decade they might still be alive? "We reopened every aspect of the investigation," Rivera continued. "We're re-interviewing original witnesses, checking alibis again, and looking at persons of interest who might have been overlooked the first time." "Who's at the top of your list?" James asked. Rivera hesitated, glancing at Sarah. There was a park maintenance worker named Carl Bennett. He was interviewed during the original investigation, had access to trails, knew the area well. His alibi was working alone in a remote section of the park, which we couldn't verify. We did a deep background check, but nothing raised red flags at the time. And now, Sarah pressed. He left his job at the park about a month after the disappearance. Moved to Wisconsin. We're having trouble locating him. He seems to have kept a very low profile for the past decade. James and Sarah exchanged glances, a flash of their old connection sparking between them. Wisconsin, James repeated. How far from where the shoe was found? That's what makes him interesting, Rivera said. The last address we have for him is in Superior, Wisconsin, directly across the lake from where the shoe washed ashore. Chapter 6. Confrontation of silence in Ellie Bennett's apartment had stretched to unbearable lengths. She stood with her back to the wall, knife still within reach, watching Carl sink on the edge of her bed. You need to tell me everything, she said finally. No more lies. No more to protect you, or you're not ready to know. I deserve the truth. Carl nodded, his shoulders slumped in defeat. You do. You always have. He took a deep breath. I was working maintenance at the park that summer. Had been for nearly 3 years. I knew every trail, every shortcut. And you saw us on the hike, Ellie prompted. Me and Lily. Yes, you were so happy, skipping ahead of your parents. I'd seen plenty of families come through, but something about you, too. He paused, struggling. You looked exactly like my daughters. My twins. They would have been your age, but they died in a house fire while I was at work. My wife, too. I couldn't save them. Ellie's grip on the knife tightened. So you decided to take us instead? To replace your dead children? No. Carl's head snapped up, eyes pleading. God, no. I would never. It was Roy Kleinman. He worked seasonal maintenance with me. He'd been watching you girls around the park for days. Had pictures on his phone. He told me he was going to take one of you. Just one. So the parents would think she wandered off and got lost. He had it all planned out. But he took both of us. Ellie said, memories flickering at the edges of her consciousness. A hand over her mouth. Her sister's muffled scream. The suffocating darkness of a van. Carl nodded miserably. I tried to talk him out of it. When that didn't work, I followed him. I was going to stop him, call the police. But by the time I caught up, he already had you both in his van. He had a knife to your sister's throat. Said he'd kill her if I didn't help him. Tears streamed down his weathered face. We drove to his cabin about 20 miles from the park. He was going to... Carl choked on the words. I couldn't let that happen. We fought. It was bad. He didn't survive it. Ellie stared at him, horrified realization dawning. You killed him. To save you, Carl insisted. Both of you. But then I didn't know what to do. I couldn't take you back. They'd know I was involved. I'd go to prison for killing Roy, even though he deserved it. And you, too, had seen everything. He wiped roughly at his tears. So I decided to take you both, give you a good home. But that night, while I was burying Roy, Lily tried to escape. She ran into the woods. And you couldn't find her, Ellie whispered, memories suddenly flooding back. The cold night air, her sister's hand slipping from hers as they ran between the trees. The moment they became separated, the sound of Carl calling in the darkness. I searched for days, Carl said. But the woods there, they're dense, unforgiving. There was a storm that night. The temperature dropped. I never found her, Emma. I think she... He couldn't finish the sentence. So you took me and left her to die, Ellie Emma said, her voice hollow. You told me she was safe with another family, that we had a separate to avoid being found. You promised me we'd reunite when it was safe. I wanted to give you something to hope for, Carl admitted. I couldn't bear to tell you the truth. And then, as years passed, it seemed kinder to let you believe she was out there somewhere, happy. Emma's legs gave way, and she slid down the wall to the floor, the knife falling from her hand. A decade of false hope, of waiting for a reunion that could never happen. Her sister, her twin, her other half, gone all this time. The police will be looking for you, she said dully. For us. That shoe, they'll trace it back here somehow. Carl nodded. I know. That's why I came home early. We need to leave. I have another place, up in Canada. We can... No. Emma's voice was firm, her eyes suddenly clear. No more running. No more hiding. Emma, please. I saved you. Everything I did was to protect you. You didn't save me, she said, rising to her feet. You stole me. You kept me from my real parents. You let me believe my sister was alive all this time. She picked up her phone from the bed. And now I'm going to call the police, and you're going to tell them everything you just told me. Carl lunged forward with surprising speed, grabbing for the phone. Emma dodged, but his momentum carried him into her, sending them both crashing into the dresser. Pain exploded in her temple as it struck the corner, and she felt warm blood trickling down her face. I can't let you do that, Carl said, his voice suddenly cold, unfamiliar. I didn't spend 10 years keeping you safe to lose you now. As her vision blurred, Emma caught sight of a newspaper article still lying on the bed. Her mother's name was in the last paragraph. Dr. Sarah Blackwood, still searching after all these years. Still hoping. With a surge of desperate strength, Emma shoved Carl backward and scrambled for her fallen phone. Her fingers closed around it just as his shadow fell over her again. She had time for one action before he reached her. Not a call, too slow. Instead, she opened the Maps application and hit Share Location, sending her current address to the emergency contact she programmed into her phone years ago, a domestic violence hotline she'd found during one of her secret planning sessions. Then Carl's weight was on her, and darkness swept in from the edges of her vision. Her last conscious thought was of Lily, lost in the woods, alone and afraid. Had her final moments been like this? Had she called out for her twin, for the sister who couldn't reach her? I'm sorry, Emma whispered as consciousness slipped away. I'm so sorry, Lily. Twins vanished during family hike. 10 years later, a shoe with initials washes up on shore chapter 7. Reunion and remembrance the call came at 3:17 a.m. Sarah and James had been reviewing case files in their hotel room, neither able to sleep, when Rivera's phone rang. His expression changed as he listened, eyes widening. We have an address in Superior, Wisconsin. Domestic violence hotline. Received an emergency location ping from an apartment registered to Carl Bennett. Local police are en route. Within minutes, they were in Rivera's car, speeding across the bridge that connected Duluth, Minnesota to Superior, Wisconsin. Sarah gripped the door handle, her mind racing with possibilities. James sat rigidly beside her, his breathing measured and controlled, the same technique he used during complicated surgeries. They've entered the apartment, Rivera reported after another call. 2 individuals found. Adult male unconscious with head trauma, young female with injuries consistent with assault. Both alive, both being transported to Lake Superior Medical Center. At the hospital, chaos reigned as a young woman was rushed into the emergency department. When Sarah and James arrived, flashing their medical credentials to bypass security, they found Detective Rivera speaking with the attending physician. She regained consciousness in the ambulance. The doctor was saying, probable concussion, lacerations requiring stitches. She's stable. And she's claiming to be Emma Blackwood, Rivera added, turning to Sarah and James. She's asking for you both by name. The world seemed to tilt beneath Sarah's feet. James steadied her, his hand finding hers and squeezing tightly. We need to confirm her identity, Rivera cautioned. DNA testing, the birthmark, Sarah interrupted. Emma has a birthmark on her left wrist, like a small butterfly. The doctor nodded. She does have such a mark. I noticed it during the initial assessment. Minutes later, they stood outside a treatment room, hesitating at the threshold. Through the gap in the curtain, they could see a young woman sitting on the edge of the bed, auburn hair falling forward to hide her face as a nurse finished bandaging her temple. Sarah moved first, pushing the curtain aside. The young woman looked up, and time seemed to fracture. She was both the 11-year-old child who had vanished and a stranger with familiar eyes. "Mom," she whispered. "Dad." The reunion that followed was beyond words, a tangle of embraces, tears, and broken questions. Emma clung to her parents as if afraid they might disappear, while Sarah and James touched her face, her hair, her hands, reassuring themselves that she was real. "Lily," Sarah finally managed to ask. "Where's Lily?" Emma's face crumpled. Through tears, she related Carl's confession, how Lily had fled into the woods that stormy night, how she had likely perished alone in the wilderness. In the days that followed, as Emma's physical wounds began to heal, the full story emerged. Carl Bennett, recovering from his own injuries under police guard, provided details that led investigators to Roy Kleinman's remains, buried near an abandoned cabin miles from the original search area. He also identified the region where Lily had disappeared, triggering a new search operation. 2 weeks later, on a crisp autumn morning, search teams found human remains in a ravine 3 miles from the cabin. Dental records confirmed what they already knew in their hearts. Lily Blackwood had died shortly after her abduction, likely from exposure and injuries sustained in a fall. The media descended like a storm. The miraculous return of one twin a decade after the disappearance, the tragic confirmation of the other's fate. But the Blackwoods, reunited yet incomplete, weathered it together. 6 months later, on a clear spring day, the 3 Blackwoods stood at the edge of Lake Superior. Emma, still adjusting to reclaiming her true identity after a decade as Ellie Bennett, held a small wooden box containing a teal sneaker, the match to the purple one that had washed ashore and set everything in motion. "I kept it hidden from Carl," she explained. "All these years, it was the only thing I had of hers." Together, they released Lily's ashes into the lake, the small box floating briefly before slipping beneath the surface. The lake that had kept their secret for so long now became Lily's final resting place. As they stood together on the shore, Sarah noticed something remarkable. Emma was humming softly, a lullaby she used to sing to the twins when they were small. "You remember that?" Sarah asked, amazed. Emma nodded. "I would hum it to myself every night. I didn't know why it comforted me, just that it felt like home." She looked out over the vast expanse of water. I think Lily would have remembered it too. James placed his hands on their shoulders, the 3 of them forming a new geometry of family, altered irrevocably by loss, yet somehow whole in their shared grief and joy. "She found her way back to us," he said quietly. "In her own way, she led you home." As the sun began to set, casting long golden light across the water, Emma took her pair in hands. Together they turned away from the lake and walked toward the future, a family forever marked by twin absences, one now miraculously filled, the other transformed into a precious memory they would carry together. Emma and Lily Blackwood disappeared in broad daylight on a family hike, with no witnesses, no clues, and no trace left behind. If this case left you wondering, click like. It helps more people hear these stories and stay alert. And tell us in the comments, what do you think happened to the Blackwood twins? Could there still be answers waiting in those woods? We read every comment, and your thoughts could help keep this case from going cold. At Gone Cold, we cover new unsolved cases every week. See you in the next video.